the grim darkness of the far future, death is not always the end of service. For the greatest heroes of the Adeptus Astartes, those warriors who have given everything in battle yet still draw breath, there exists a fate that some call honor and others call curse. This is the story of what happens when a dreadnought awakens after centuries of sleep, when consciousness returns to a mind trapped in steel, when ancient warriors rise once more to face enemies they may no longer recognize in a galaxy that has moved on without them. The Dreadnought represents one of the most profound contradictions in the Imperium of man. These towering war engines, standing 12 to 15 feet tall and bristling with enough firepower to level fortifications, are both revered relics and walking nightmares. Inside each adamantium shell lies not a machine spirit or artificial intelligence, but the broken remnants of a space marine hero, a warrior whose body was so catastrophically damaged that even the advanced medical arts of the apothecaries could not restore it. Instead of granting them the mercy of death, the chapter chooses to preserve these fallen brothers, sealing what remains of their shattered forms into life support sarcophagi and integrating them directly into the neural systems of these combat walkers. But the Dreadnought is not meant to be awake continuously. The strain of maintaining consciousness while interfaced with such a massive and complex war machine creates immense psychological pressure. Extended neural connection causes lethargy, confusion, temporal disorientation, and eventually senility. The human mind, even one enhanced by space marine implants and conditioning, was never designed to perceive the world through Auspex arrays and weapon targeting systems for years on end. So the chapters practice a form of mercy that might seem cruel to outsiders. Between battles, these ancient warriors are sealed away in stasis vaults, deep within fortress monasteries, their consciousness suspended in a darkness that can last decades, centuries, or in the case of the most ancient, millennia. And then comes the awakening. A call goes out across the Vox networks, emergency protocols activate, and somewhere in the depths of a chapter's sacred halls, systems begin to hum with renewed power. Life support fluids warm from their near-frozen state. Neural interfaces pulse with renewed energy, and a consciousness that has been suspended in the void between sleep and death begins the long, agonizing climb back toward awareness. This is not the gentle waking of natural rest. This is resurrection, a forced return to a reality that the awakening warrior may not remember clearly, may not recognize, and may not wish to face again. The physical reality of awakening. The first sensation is always the cold. Not the cold of winter air or icy wind, but the profound chill of amniotic fluid that has been kept just above freezing for preservation purposes. This fluid fills the sarcophagus surrounding what remains of the Dreadnought pilot's organic body, keeping tissues viable and preventing decay. As the awakening sequence begins, heating elements activate and the temperature slowly rises, but the sensation is far from pleasant. The pilot's nerve endings, some of which have been directly spliced into mechanical interfaces, register this change not as warming comfort, but as a creeping sensation of pins and needles that spreads through every remaining inch of flesh. Many Dreadnought pilots no longer possess much of their original bodies. Some are reduced to little more than a torso and head, their limbs lost to catastrophic wounds. Others retain more, but it hardly matters. What flesh remains is webbed with cables, punctured by neural shunts, and suspended in fluid, like a specimen in a laboratory jar. As consciousness returns, the pilot must reconcile the phantom sensations of limbs long lost with the reality of their current state. The human brain is remarkably adaptable, but even space marine neuroplasticity has limits. The sensation of having arms and legs that are actually weapon mounts and hydraulic struts never becomes entirely natural. Then comes the flood of sensory data. A human being perceives the world through eyes that detect a specific range of light wavelengths, ears that register sound waves, skin that feels pressure and temperature, A Dreadnought pilot perceives reality through a bewildering array of technical sensors. Optical feeds come online first, but these are not simple cameras. They provide thermal imaging overlays, motion tracking, range-finding data, threat assessment markers, and tactical information all simultaneously. The visual field of a Dreadnought is not the narrow cone of human vision, but a comprehensive 360-degree awareness of the surrounding environment. For a pilot awakening after decades or centuries of sensory deprivation, this deluge of information can be overwhelming. Audio sensors activate next, but these do not hear as humans hear. They detect sound across a far wider frequency range, can triangulate the precise origin of noises, and automatically filter out background interference while enhancing tactically relevant sounds. The crackling of power systems charging up, the hydraulic hiss of servos testing their range of motion, the distant echo of footsteps approaching the stasis chamber. All of these reach the pilot's awareness with crystalline clarity. But there is also the constant hum of the Dreadnought's own systems, a mechanical susurrus that becomes the soundtrack to every waking moment, a reminder that the body they now inhabit is fundamentally inhuman. The sense of touch, perhaps the most fundamentally human of all senses, has been transformed into something alien. Pressure sensors distributed across the Dreadnought's armored hull relay information about impacts, but these register not as pain, but as data points. Temperature monitoring systems detect environmental conditions, but the pilot no longer feels heat or cold in the way they once did. The amniotic fluid maintains their organic tissues at a constant temperature, regardless of external conditions. When a Dreadnought's massive power fist closes around an enemy vehicle, crushing it to scrap metal, the pilot feels the resistance through force feedback systems, but it is a distant, attenuated sensation, more like reading a report than experiencing a tactile event. And there is pain. Not always and not for everyone, but pain is a common companion to Dreadnought pilots. The neural interfaces that allow them to control their mechanical bodies require direct connection to their nervous systems. These connections can become inflamed, can develop scar tissue, can simply ache from the strain of channeling so much information. Some describe it as a headache that never fully fades, a pressure behind the eyes that intensifies during combat, when reflexes must be lightning fast and targeting calculations must be made in fractions of seconds. Others speak of phantom limb pain, magnified to nightmarish proportions, the sensation of wounds in body parts they no longer possess, ghost injuries that cannot heal because the flesh they inhabit is long gone. The awakening process itself typically takes hours. It is not instantaneous. Systems must be brought online in sequence to avoid overloading either the mechanical systems or the pilot's neural capacity. First come basic life support functions, ensuring that the organic components are being properly sustained. Then sensory systems activate gradually, allowing the pilot's consciousness to adjust to each new stream of input. Motor control comes last, with movement capabilities unlocked only after extensive diagnostic checks confirm that the pilot's mental state is stable enough to handle controlling several tons of adamantium and weaponry. During this slow return to consciousness, many Dreadnought pilots experience disorientation that borders on existential terror. They may not immediately remember who they are, where they are, or what has happened to them. The mind, emerging from centuries of stasis, does not wake with full clarity. Memories surface slowly, fragmentarily, like debris floating to the surface of dark water. A pilot might remember their name before they remember their chapter. They might recall specific battles with crystalline clarity while having no idea how much time has passed since those engagements. The awakening mind grasps for context, for meaning, for anything that will explain the sensations flooding through neural pathways that have been dormant for so long. And then there are the voices. Tech marines monitoring the awakening process, chaplains performing ritual blessings, chapter commanders providing briefings on whatever crisis has necessitated this resurrection. These voices come through Vox speakers, filtered and distorted by mechanical translation. The Dreadnought. Pilot's own voice, when they finally speak, emerges not from a throat and mouth, but from speakers embedded in their chassis. The sound is harsh, crackling with static, a mechanical approximation of human speech that strips away the subtle nuances of emotion and intonation. Many pilots describe the horror of hearing themselves speak for the first time after internment, of realizing that even their voice, that most personal form of expression, has been taken from them and replaced with something synthetic. The physical awakening is only the beginning. Once the systems are fully online and the pilot has regained enough control to operate the Dreadnought's basic functions, they must confront a reality that is often far more painful than any physical sensation. They must face the fact that time has moved on without them, that the world they knew has changed, and that they are no longer the person they were when they last walked among their brothers as a flesh and blood space marine. Mental disorientation and time loss. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of Dreadnought existence is the relationship with time. For the pilot sealed in stasis, no time passes. There are no dreams, no thoughts, no consciousness at all during the long sleep. One moment, they are being shut down after a battle. The next moment, they are awakening to a new crisis. But between these two subjective moments, decades or centuries might have elapsed. The galaxy has turned, wars have been fought and won or lost, brothers have lived full lives and died, and the awakening pilot has missed all of it. This temporal displacement creates profound cognitive dissonance. Imagine closing your eyes for what feels like a single night's sleep, then waking to discover that everyone you knew is dead, that the world has moved on by generations, that you are now considered an ancient relic rather than a contemporary warrior. This is the reality facing every Dreadnought pilot with each awakening. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Human beings, even augmented space marines, construct their sense of self through continuity of experience. We understand who we are by remembering who we were yesterday, last week, last year. But when those intervals are measured in centuries rather than days, the very concept of personal identity becomes unstable. Many pilots experience severe dyschronometria, a clinical term for the inability to accurately perceive the passage of time. A Dreadnought awakening, after 200 years of stasis, might insist that only a few months have passed since their last deployment. They ask after brothers who have been dead for a century, expect to see familiar faces that have long since been laid to rest in the chapter's mausoleums. When informed of how much time has actually elapsed, their reactions range from denial to grief to a kind of numb acceptance that slowly erodes their sense of connection to the present. This confusion is compounded by the nature of memory itself. The human brain does not store memories like data files on a cogitator. Memories are living things, constantly being reconstructed and reinterpreted based on context and emotional state. But Dreadnought pilots are not fully human anymore. Parts of their brain have been augmented or replaced with mechanical systems designed to help them process the sensory input from their new bodies. These augmentations can interfere with memory formation and recall. Some pilots find that their memories of life before internment fade with each awakening, becoming increasingly hazy and dreamlike. Others experience the opposite problem. Certain memories become fixed and immutable, playing over and over with perfect clarity, while everything around those frozen moments becomes fog. The chapters try to help. When a Dreadnought awakens, there are usually protocols in place to reorient the pilot to current reality. A tech marine or chaplain will provide a briefing covering essential information: the current date, major events that have occurred since the last awakening, the status of the chapter and its current campaigns. But this is like trying to catch up on centuries of history through a few minutes of explanation. the details are lost, the nuance is absent, and the awakening pilot is left with a sense of fundamental disconnection from the timeline they now inhabit. Some dreadnoughts develop coping mechanisms. They stop trying to maintain continuity with their past selves and instead embrace each awakening as a new beginning. They accept that they are no longer brother Captain so-and-so who fought in the wars of their youth, but are now ancient so-and-so, a being apart from the flow of normal time. This psychological adaptation allows them to function, but it comes at a cost. It requires letting go of the person they once were, accepting that their identity is now defined more by their role as a dreadnought than by their memories of life before the sarcophagus. Others resist this dissolution of self with desperate intensity. They cling to their memories, rehearsing them mentally during their brief periods of wakefulness, trying to maintain the thread of continuity that defines them as individuals. But this too has its costs. The more energy they spend trying to remember who they were, the less they have available for adapting to who they must be now. And with each awakening, the gap between past and present widens. The chapter they served may have evolved new traditions, adopted different tactical doctrines, reorganized its command structure. The enemies they fight may be new threats or old foes returned in unfamiliar forms. The galaxy itself may have changed in ways both subtle and profound. The confusion extends beyond mere dates and names. Many dreadnought pilots experience a phenomenon that might be called memory compression, where decades or centuries of real time feel like they should only be days or weeks. This creates a profound sense of unreality, as if they are living in a dream or hallucination. They might remember a particular battle brother as a young neophyte, then wake to find him serving as a company captain, or perhaps already dead and buried. The emotional impact of discovering that someone you remember as young and vital is now old, or worse, has been dead for generations, is devastating. It creates a profound sense of loss, compounded by guilt at having missed the intervening years. Some pilots report experiencing something even stranger: overlapping memories from multiple awakenings that blur together in confusing ways. A dreadnought who has been awakened dozens or hundreds of times over the centuries might struggle to distinguish between different campaigns, different battles, different versions of similar events. Was it the war on Armageddon or the defense of Cadia where they saw that particular tactical pattern? Was that brother who fought beside them part of the first company or the third? The memories exist, but their temporal organization breaks down, creating a kind of experiential palimpsest, where layers of different moments overlay each other until it becomes impossible to separate them clearly. This temporal confusion is made worse by the fact that many dreadnoughts are awakened specifically for battles or situations that echo past conflicts. The Imperium is locked in eternal war, and history tends to repeat itself with grim regularity. A dreadnought who fought orcs on one world might wake centuries later to fight orcs on another world, and in the heat of battle, might not be entirely clear on which war they are currently fighting. The result can be a kind of combat fugue, where past and present merge, where the pilot is simultaneously fighting a battle from centuries ago, and the current engagement, their awareness, flickering between different temporal moments like a pict screen with bad reception. The chapters are aware of this problem, which is why most ancient dreadnoughts are kept in stasis for increasingly long periods. The longer the sleep between awakenings, the more stable the pilot's mental state tends to be when they do wake, though paradoxically, this also means greater temporal displacement and confusion about how much time has actually passed. It is a balance with no good solutions, only varying degrees of psychological trauma that must be managed as best as possible. For some pilots, the realization of how much time has passed brings an unexpected emotion: grief. Not just for lost friends and fallen brothers, but for their own lost time. Every moment spent in stasis is a moment of life that did not happen, experiences that were not had, relationships that could not develop. A space marine's lifespan is already extended far beyond normal human years through genetic modification and the senescent membrane that can place them in healing hibernation. But a dreadnought's existence stretches this even further, granting a kind of cursed immortality where centuries of life are compressed into brief windows of consciousness, separated by vast voids of nothingness. Some pilots begin to develop a strange relationship with the concept of age. Chronologically, they might be 500, 1,000, even 10,000 years old. But in terms of conscious experience, they have lived far less. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the most ancient of all loyalist dreadnoughts, is over 10,000 years old chronologically, but has been awake for only a tiny fraction of that time. How old is he really? The question has no simple answer. He has existed for millennia, but experienced only centuries of that existence. He is simultaneously the oldest and yet somehow still young, a paradox that defies easy comprehension. This temporal discontinuity affects not just personal identity, but tactical effectiveness. Modern warfare doctrine may have evolved significantly since a dreadnought's last awakening. Weapons technologies change, enemy tactics adapt, strategic priorities shift. An ancient warrior's knowledge and experience are invaluable, but only if they can successfully contextualize that knowledge within current circumstances. Many chapters maintain extensive debriefing protocols for awakened dreadnoughts, bringing them up to speed on current situations before deploying them. But there is only so much that can be conveyed in a briefing, and the subtle nuances of how warfare has evolved are often learned only through direct experience. The psychological literature on extended stasis and its effects on consciousness is limited, mostly because the only beings who regularly undergo such experiences are dreadnought pilots themselves, and their accounts are often fragmentary and confused. But what records exist paint a picture of minds struggling to maintain coherence across temporal gaps that would shatter lesser beings entirely. The fact that space marine psychology and the mental conditioning they undergo during their transformation help them survive this ordeal at all is remarkable. That some pilots maintain their sanity and sense of self for centuries or even millennia of this existence is nothing short of miraculous. That many do not is hardly surprising. The weight of centuries. When a dreadnought awakens, they do not wake into the chapter they remember. They wake into a chapter that has moved on without them, filled with unfamiliar faces and sometimes unfamiliar traditions. For many pilots, this is the most painful aspect of awakening, the realization that they have become strangers in what was once their home. The first thing many notice is the faces. As a flesh and blood space marine, even one who had served for a century or more, you would have known your battle brothers. You would have fought alongside them, trained with them, shared meals in the chapter's halls. You would have known their habits, their quirks, the particular way each one moved and spoke. But after a century or two in stasis, most of those brothers are gone. Some have died in battle, their gene seed harvested to create new recruits. Others have succumbed to age, for even space marines are not truly immortal, and even their enhanced lifespans have limits. A few might have been elevated to command positions where the dreadnought pilot no longer has regular contact with them, but the vast majority are simply gone. In their place are new faces, young warriors who were not even born when the dreadnought pilot last walked among his brothers. These new space marines look upon the ancient warrior with reverence, treating them as a living relic rather than as a contemporary. They speak to the dreadnought with formal respect, addressing them by honorifics and titles rather than as a fellow brother-in-arms. The casual camaraderie that once existed is gone, replaced by something more akin to worship. The dreadnought has become an object of veneration, and while this might seem like an honor, it is also profoundly isolating. Many dreadnought pilots report feeling disconnected from the younger generations of space marines. These new warriors are well-trained and motivated, certainly, but they lack the shared history that creates true bonds of brotherhood. They did not fight alongside the Dreadnought pilot in past campaigns. They do not share the same formative experiences. To them, the ancient warrior is a figure from history, someone they have heard about in chapter legends, but never actually known as a person. And to the Dreadnought pilot, these young Marines are strangers, unfamiliar faces in armor that looks almost but not quite like what they remember. This isolation is compounded by the physical reality of being a Dreadnought. The ancient warrior cannot share a meal with their brothers, cannot clasp hands in greeting, cannot engage in the small physical interactions that build and maintain social bonds. They experience the chapter's communal life at a remove, observing but never truly participating. When the company gathers for a feast after a victory, the Dreadnought cannot join them at the table. When warriors train in the practice cages, the Dreadnought cannot spar alongside them. They are present but separate, included but apart. Some chapters try to maintain connections between ancient Dreadnoughts and the current generation of Space Marines. Young warriors might be assigned to serve as attendants or escorts for awakened ancients, learning from their wisdom and experience while providing companionship and context for the current state of the chapter. These relationships can be meaningful, but they are not friendships between equals. The power dynamic is too imbalanced, the age gap too vast. The young Marine is always aware that they are speaking to a legend, and the ancient is always aware that this youth was not even a possibility when they entered their sarcophagus. The chapter itself may have changed in ways both subtle and profound. Traditions evolve over centuries, new heroes arise, and their deeds become the subjects of new sagas and rituals. Old enemies are defeated, and new threats emerge. The very culture of the chapter, the unspoken assumptions and shared understandings that bind warriors together, shifts gradually with each passing generation. A Dreadnought awakening after several centuries might find that their chapter has developed new battle cries, modified its heraldry, adopted different tactical preferences, or even reinterpreted its founding principles in ways that seem alien to the ancient warrior's memories. This cultural drift can be deeply disorienting. The chapter is still recognizably itself, still bearing the same name and gene line, still fighting for the Emperor and the Imperium. But the details have shifted. References the ancient makes might go unrecognized by younger Marines who lack the historical context. Jokes that would have brought laughter centuries ago fall flat because the shared experiences they referenced are long forgotten. The Dreadnought pilot finds themselves speaking a cultural language that has evolved beyond their understanding, using idioms and references that mark them as being from another time. Some chapters are better than others at maintaining institutional memory and helping awakened Dreadnoughts feel connected to the current generation. The Space Wolves, for instance, have strong oral traditions and place great emphasis on storytelling and saga keeping, which helps maintain continuity across the centuries. When Bjorn the Fell-Handed awakens, even young Bloodclaws know his stories and can engage with him through that shared narrative tradition. Other chapters might be less successful at maintaining these connections, particularly if they have suffered severe losses or undergone dramatic reorganizations in the intervening years. The loss extends beyond just people and culture. Physical spaces change too. The Dreadnought might remember a particular training hall or meditation chamber, only to discover it has been repurposed or destroyed. The view from the fortress monastery's ramparts might have changed as the surrounding landscape was developed or devastated by war. Even small things, like the arrangement of trophies in a trophy hall or the placement of memorial stones in a garden of remembrance, might have been altered in ways that disorient the awakening ancient. And then there are the dead. Oh, the dead. Every awakening brings a new accounting of losses. Brothers who were vital and strong at the last awakening are now nothing but names carved on memorial walls. Officers who once commanded companies are now dust and memory. Friends, rivals, subordinates, superiors, all of them gone into the Emperor's embrace while the Dreadnought slept. Some pilots request full accounting, wanting to know who has fallen and how. Others prefer not to know, finding the accumulated weight of loss too crushing to bear. But ignorance is not truly possible. The dead are everywhere, present in their absence, their loss written in the unfamiliar faces and the changed traditions, and the way younger Marines speak of the past as ancient history. This grief is complicated by guilt. Many Dreadnought pilots feel that they have somehow failed their brothers by not being there, by sleeping while others fought and died. This is irrational, of course. The pilot had no choice in when they were awakened or how long they slept. But grief and guilt are not rational emotions. The survivor's burden weighs heavily, made worse by the knowledge that more will die, that the next awakening will bring news of new losses, and the cycle will continue until either the Dreadnought is finally destroyed or everyone they once knew has passed into history. Some ancient warriors cope by deliberately limiting their emotional investment in the current generation. They maintain a professional distance, fulfilling their function as war engines and tactical advisors without forming close bonds that will inevitably lead to more grief. This is a survival mechanism, a way of protecting what remains of their humanity against the endless erosion of loss. But it comes at a cost, further isolating them from the chapter they serve and accelerating their transformation from person into thing, from brother Marine into relic. Others go the opposite direction, trying desperately to forge new connections with each awakening, to learn the names and faces of the current generation, to participate in chapter life as much as their physical limitations allow. These pilots often experience the most acute grief, but they also maintain the strongest sense of self and purpose. They remain people, rather than becoming mere weapons, but the price is constant heartache, as each new sleep brings the certainty of more losses to grieve upon awakening. The weight of centuries is not just emotional, it is also tactical and strategic. An ancient Dreadnought carries within their memory banks knowledge of campaigns fought long ago, of enemies defeated and lessons learned. This wisdom is invaluable, one of the primary reasons chapters go to such lengths to preserve their fallen heroes. But accessing this wisdom requires the pilot to sort through centuries of accumulated experience, to find relevant knowledge amid vast stores of information that may no longer apply to current circumstances. It requires bridging the gap between then and now, between how wars were fought in the past and how they are fought in the present. Many chapters hold counsel with awakened ancients before major campaigns, seeking their advice and perspective. These counsels can be profoundly valuable, with the ancient warrior's experience providing insights that help avoid costly mistakes or identify opportunities that less experienced commanders might miss. But they can also be frustrating for both parties. The ancient might offer advice based on how similar situations were handled centuries ago, not realizing that circumstances have changed in ways that render that advice obsolete. The current commanders might lack the historical knowledge to properly understand what the ancient is trying to communicate, missing nuances that would be obvious to someone who had lived through the original events. This is the burden of being a living repository of history. Your value lies in your knowledge of the past, but your effectiveness depends on your ability to apply that knowledge to a present that may be radically different from what you remember. It is a constant negotiation between continuity and change, between honoring what was and adapting to what is. And underlying it all is the awareness that with each awakening, the gap widens, the connections weaken, and the ancient warrior becomes more alien to the chapter they serve, and more isolated in their existence as something between hero and relic, between warrior and memorial. Different patterns, different experiences. Not all dreadnoughts are created equal, and the pattern of the chassis has a profound impact on what the pilot experiences during and after awakening. Each design represents different compromises between functionality, preservation, and the toll taken on the pilot's physical and mental well-being. Understanding these differences is crucial to understanding why some dreadnoughts maintain their sanity for millennia, while others degrade rapidly into madness or physical collapse. The Castroferrum pattern is the most common dreadnought chassis in the 41st millennium. It is the workhorse of the Adeptus Astartes, the design most people picture when they think of a Space Marine dreadnought. The Castroferrum is relatively compact compared to some ancient patterns, standing roughly 12 feet tall with a boxy, utilitarian design that prioritizes reliability and ease of maintenance. For the pilot, the Castroferrum provides a reasonably stable platform. The neural interface technology is well understood and has been refined over millennia of use. The amniotic sarcophagus provides adequate life support, and the sensory systems, while overwhelming at first, can be adapted to with practice. Pilots of Castroferrum pattern dreadnoughts report that the awakening process is typically the smoothest of all chassis types. Systems come online in predictable sequence, and the flood of sensory data, while still intense, is manageable for a properly trained Space Marine consciousness. The Castroferrum's controls are intuitive, at least as intuitive as piloting a several-ton walking war machine can be, and the weapon systems are straightforward to operate. This doesn't mean it's pleasant, but it does mean it's survivable, at least in the psychological sense. The trade-off is that the Castroferrum is not the most powerful or advanced design. Its weapons, while formidable, are not as devastating as those mounted on larger patterns. Its armor, though thick, is not impenetrable. Its mobility is adequate, but not exceptional. The Castroferrum is a reliable, solid platform that will serve for centuries if properly maintained, but it will never be the most impressive dreadnought on the battlefield. For many pilots, this is acceptable. They did not seek glory in their new existence. They sought only to continue serving, and the Castroferrum allows them to do exactly that. The Contemptor pattern represents an older, more sophisticated technology from the Great Crusade era. These dreadnoughts are taller and more graceful than the Castroferrum, with articulated limbs that move with surprising fluidity. The Contemptor's design incorporates atomantic shielding technology and advanced sensory suites that make it a superior weapons platform in almost every respect. For the pilot, this means enhanced capabilities but also increased complexity. The neural load required to operate a Contemptor is significantly higher than that of a Castroferrum. The pilot must process more information, make faster decisions, and maintain tighter control over more sophisticated systems. Awakening in a Contemptor can be a more jarring experience. The sensory input is richer and more detailed, which means more for the emerging consciousness to process and integrate. The controls are more responsive, requiring finer mental discipline to avoid jerky or excessive movements. But for pilots who successfully adapt, the Contemptor offers a sense of empowerment that few other chassis can match. You are not just a walking weapons platform. You are a sophisticated war machine that can go toe-to-toe with the deadliest enemies the Imperium faces. The rarity of functional Contemptor chassis means that they are typically reserved for the most honored and ancient warriors. To be placed in a Contemptor is a mark of exceptional respect, a recognition that your service and sacrifice merit the chapter's most precious resources. This can be a source of pride for the pilot, but it also increases the burden of expectation. You are not just any dreadnought, you are one of the ancients, piloting technology that cannot be replaced if destroyed, expected to perform at the highest level in the most critical situations. The Redemptor pattern, developed by Archmagos Belisarius Call as part of his Primaris Space Marine project, represents the bleeding edge of dreadnought technology. These massive war machines are larger and more powerful than standard Castroferrum dreadnoughts, with devastating firepower and the ability to move at speeds that seem impossible for something so massive. The Redemptor is built for aggressive warfare, designed to charge into the heart of enemy formations and tear them apart with overwhelming violence. But the Redemptor's power comes with a terrible price. The neural interface is so intensive, the power draw so immense, that it literally burns out the pilot. The awakening process for a Redemptor pilot is described as agonizing, with the machine systems placing enormous strain on the pilot's consciousness and physical form, even in the moments of coming online. Once operational, the Redemptor pilot must endure a level of neural stress that would be unsustainable in any other chassis. Every movement, every weapon firing, every combat maneuver drains life force from the pilot in ways that are not fully understood, but are undeniably real. Many Redemptors have already required replacement pilots after just a few decades of service. Their original occupants burned out to nothing but desiccated husks. For a Redemptor pilot, each awakening might be their last. The knowledge that your existence is being consumed by the very machine that was supposed to preserve it creates a psychological burden unique to this pattern. Some embrace it, throwing themselves into combat with abandon, knowing that they will not survive long enough to face the slow degradation that afflicts pilots of older patterns. Others find it horrifying, a betrayal of the promise that internment in a Dreadnought would allow them to serve for centuries or millennia. Instead, they are being used up and discarded, their sacrifice measured in years or decades rather than centuries. The awakening experience in a Redemptor is thus colored by urgency and desperation. There is no luxury of taking time to reorient to current reality, no gentle reintegration into chapter life. The Redemptor pilot wakes knowing that the clock is ticking, that every moment of consciousness brings them closer to final dissolution, and that they must make every battle count, because there might not be many left. This creates a kind of frantic intensity that can be tactically valuable, but is psychologically exhausting. The Leviathan pattern, another relic from the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy era, represents perhaps the most extreme expression of Dreadnought design philosophy. These behemoths are larger even than Redemptors, mounting weapons systems powerful enough to threaten Titan-class war engines. The Leviathan was designed for siege warfare, for breaking through fortifications that could withstand lesser forces. Its adamantic shielding can shrug off hits that would cripple other Dreadnoughts, and its firepower is truly apocalyptic. But the price for this power is madness. The neural strain of piloting a Leviathan is so intense that pilots inevitably suffer psychological degradation. They experience temporal displacement far worse than other Dreadnought pilots, becoming trapped in loops where they relive past battles, unable to distinguish between memory and present reality. Many Leviathan pilots eventually lose coherent consciousness entirely, becoming little more than berserkers who must be carefully managed and pointed at appropriate targets. The awakening process for a Leviathan pilot is thus fraught with danger, as there is always the risk that the pilot will not successfully emerge from stasis, but will instead remain trapped in some liminal state between consciousness and madness. Specialized variants like the Librarian Dreadnought add their own complications. These rare machines house psychically gifted space marines, warriors who wielded the powers of the warp in life and continue to do so in their mechanical existence. For a Librarian pilot, awakening involves not just the usual sensory shock and temporal disorientation, but also the reactivation of psychic senses. The pilot must re-establish their connection to the warp, must rebuild the mental disciplines that allow them to channel supernatural forces without being consumed by them. This is dangerous under any circumstances, but doing it while also adapting to a Dreadnought's sensory systems and dealing with the psychological impacts of centuries of stasis creates compound risks. Many Librarian Dreadnoughts report that the warp feels different after stasis, though they struggle to articulate exactly how. Some describe it as if the currents of the Imperium have shifted while they slept, requiring them to relearn navigation of psychic space. Others speak of connections that must be reformed, rituals that must be reperformed to restore their full capabilities. And there is always the danger that the pilot's grip on sanity, already strained by the Dreadnought experience, might not be strong enough to prevent warp entities from exploiting any weakness in their psychic defenses. The Death Company Dreadnoughts of the Blood Angels and their successor chapters represent perhaps the most tragic variant. These machines house brothers who have succumbed to the Black Rage, the genetic curse that causes Blood Angels to relive Sanguinius's final moments during the Horus Heresy. For these pilots, awakening is not a return to clarity, but a plunge into madness. They do not know where or when they are. They believe they are fighting at the siege of Terra, defending their Primarch against Horus's treachery. The chapter directs this madness toward the enemy, using Death Company Dreadnoughts as berserker shock troops. But there is no real awakening for these warriors, only an endless delusion from which they can never escape. The Grey Knight's Dreadnoughts incorporate the chapter's unique psychic technologies and demonic wards directly into the chassis. For a Grey Knight pilot, awakening involves not just physical systems coming online, but psychic protections activating, sanctified circuits completing their patterns of power. The pilot must center themselves within these protections, must ensure that their mind is properly shielded before they can safely operate in a galaxy where demonic corruption is an ever-present threat. This adds additional layers of ritual and preparation to the awakening process. But it also provides certain advantages. The psychic wards help stabilize the pilot's consciousness, reducing some of the temporal disorientation and memory degradation that affect other dreadnought patterns. Each pattern thus offers a different experience of awakening, a different balance of power and preservation, capability and cost. The pilot's experience is shaped not just by how long they have slept or what battles await them, but by the very nature of the machine they inhabit. Some chassis are prisons that slowly grind down the occupant's humanity. Others are partnerships between warrior and machine that can be sustained for millennia if managed properly. And some are funeral pyres, consuming the pilot even as they preserve them, burning away life force to fuel one last blaze of destructive glory before final darkness falls. The psychological burden. The physical challenges of awakening are immense, but they pale in comparison to the psychological burden that dreadnought pilots must bear. The human mind, even one enhanced and conditioned by Space Marine indoctrination, was not designed for the kind of existence that internment in a dreadnought creates. The isolation, the temporal discontinuity, the loss of physical form, the endless cycle of awakening to war and returning to dreamless sleep, all of these accumulate into a psychological weight that eventually crushes almost everyone who bears it. Isolation is perhaps the most immediate and persistent psychological challenge. Even when awakened and deployed alongside other Space Marines, the dreadnought pilot exists in profound isolation. They cannot shake hands with their brothers, cannot share a meal, cannot engage in any of the small physical interactions that create and maintain social bonds. Their sensory experience of reality is fundamentally different from that of flesh and blood warriors. They see the world through Auspex feeds and targeting overlays. They hear through acoustic sensors that filter and process sound before presenting it to their consciousness. Every interaction is mediated through layers of technology, creating a barrier that can never be fully crossed. This isolation is compounded during the long periods of stasis. Between awakenings, the pilot experiences nothing. No dreams, no thoughts, no awareness. They are not sleeping in any meaningful sense. They are simply not. And then they wake, and the world has moved on without them, and everyone they knew has changed or died, and they are more alone than before. Each cycle deepens the isolation, widening the gulf between the pilot and the living world around them. Many pilots describe a growing sense of disconnection from humanity itself. As the years accumulate, as awakening follows awakening across centuries, they begin to feel less like a person trapped in a machine and more like a machine that remembers having once been a person. Their thoughts become more tactical, more focused on optimal weapons loadouts and firing solutions and threat assessments. Emotional responses dull and fade. The capacity for joy, for sorrow, for any feeling beyond a grim satisfaction at objectives completed slowly erodes. This is partly a defense mechanism, the psyche protecting itself against endless grief and loss by simply stopping caring. But it is also a fundamental change in consciousness, a transformation from person to thing that happens so gradually that the pilot might not even realize it is occurring. Some fight against this dehumanization with desperate intensity. They deliberately maintain emotional connections, force themselves to feel grief for fallen brothers, even though they know more loss is inevitable, cling to memories of what it felt like to be fully alive and human. These warriors suffer more in the short term, but retain more of their essential selves across the centuries. They remain people rather than becoming mere weapons, though the effort of maintaining that humanity exacts a terrible price. Others accept the transformation, even welcome it. If you are going to be a weapon, they reason, better to be an effective weapon, unencumbered by doubt or grief or the lingering ghost of who you used to be. These pilots often become the most formidable combat assets their chapters possess, utterly ruthless and tactically brilliant. But there is a question about whether they remain truly conscious in any meaningful sense. Are they still the person who was interred, or has that person been replaced by something that merely uses their memories as tactical data? The dreams, or rather the lack of dreams, haunt many pilots. During stasis, there should be nothing. The consciousness is suspended, all neural activity reduced to the bare minimum necessary to maintain basic life support. But many pilots report experiencing something during the long sleep, though they struggle to articulate what. Some describe it as a kind of grey void, where fragmentary thoughts and memories drift without purpose or coherence. Others speak of a sensation of falling through infinite darkness, of reaching for something that is always just beyond grasp. A few claim they can hear voices during stasis, though they cannot understand what is being said or who is speaking. These experiences might be artifacts of the neural interface, glitches in the systems that are supposed to maintain consciousness in suspension, or they might be genuine mental activity occurring at some level too deep for the pilot to fully access or remember upon awakening. Either way, they create an additional layer of psychological stress. The pilot never knows if the void they descend into when systems shut down will be the merciful nothing they expect, or some nightmare half-consciousness that cannot end until awakening comes. Senility and cognitive degradation are constant threats. The extended neural interface causes cumulative damage over time. Dyschronometria worsens with each awakening. Memory becomes less reliable. Temporal sequence becomes confused. Some ancient pilots reach a point where they can no longer distinguish between different awakenings, where all their battles blur together into a single, endless war that has been raging since time immemorial. They might believe they are still fighting enemies from centuries ago, might not recognize that the galaxy around them has changed. This degradation manifests in different ways. Some pilots become fixated on particular memories, repeating the same stories or asking after brothers long dead as if they were still living. Others lose the ability to form new memories entirely, awakening fresh each time with no recollection of previous awakenings, trapped in an eternal present where nothing ever changes, even as everything around them does. Still others develop a kind of combat fugue, where they function perfectly well during battle, but become confused and disoriented during briefings or debriefings, unable to maintain focus when the stimulus of combat is absent. The chapters try to manage this degradation through careful monitoring, and by limiting how long and how often ancient dreadnoughts are awakened. But it is ultimately a losing battle. The very thing that keeps the pilot alive, the neural interface that allows them to operate the dreadnought, is also the thing that is slowly destroying their mind. Every moment of consciousness contributes to the cumulative damage. Every awakening brings the pilot closer to the point where they can no longer function as a coherent consciousness. For some, madness is the eventual destination. The isolation, the grief, the temporal confusion, the physical pain, the existential horror of existence, as a brain in a jar piloting a war machine. All of it accumulates until the mind simply breaks. The pilot might become violent and unpredictable, attacking allies as readily as enemies. They might retreat into catatonia, consciousness still present but no longer responsive to external stimuli. They might fragment entirely, with different aspects of their personality emerging at different times, creating a kind of mechanical, dissociative identity disorder. When a Dreadnought pilot reaches this point, most chapters face a terrible decision. Do they continue to wake the ancient warrior for battle, accepting the unpredictability and danger they pose to their own forces? Do they seal them away permanently, honoring their sacrifice with eternal rest? Or do they mercifully end the pilot's existence, granting them the death that was denied when they were first interred? There is no easy answer, and different chapters handle these situations differently, based on their traditions and philosophical approaches to the value of life versus the demands of duty. The Black Rage, the Red Thirst, and other gene seed curses add their own complications for chapters afflicted by such conditions. A Blood Angel's Dreadnought pilot might experience the psychological burdens all pilots face, but with the added horror of potentially succumbing to their chapter's genetic flaws while trapped in a metal body. The pilot exists in constant fear that their next awakening will be their last moment of clarity before the Black Rage takes them and they are transferred to a death. Company Dreadnought, doomed to spend eternity reliving Sanguinius's death while their body is used as a weapon against their chapter's enemies. Some pilots develop obsessive thoughts or compulsive behaviors as coping mechanisms. They might insist on specific rituals before and after combat, particular sequences of system checks or weapon blessings that must be performed exactly the same way every time. These rituals provide structure and predictability in an existence that otherwise offers neither. But they can also become debilitating if the obsession grows too strong, if the pilot becomes so fixated on ritual observance that they lose flexibility in combat or spend all their conscious energy on compulsions rather than tactical effectiveness. Religious faith can be both salvation and source of torment for Dreadnought pilots. Many find comfort in their service to the Emperor, in the belief that their sacrifice serves a higher purpose, and that they will eventually be rewarded with rest in his presence. Prayer and devotion provide psychological anchors, ways of maintaining meaning and purpose even as everything else erodes. But faith can also amplify despair when the pilot begins to wonder if they have been forgotten by the Emperor, if their existence is punishment rather than reward, if the God Emperor they serve would truly wish this existence on any of his servants. The question of suicide, if such a term can even apply, haunts some pilots. They cannot simply choose to die. They exist at the chapter's pleasure, awakened when needed and return to stasis when not. But they can choose to fight recklessly, to take unnecessary risks in combat, to essentially seek destruction on the battlefield. Most chapters watch for this behavior and intervene when they detect it. But it is not always obvious when a Dreadnought pilot is seeking death rather than simply fighting with appropriate aggression. And perhaps some chapters allow it, recognizing that for a warrior who has endured centuries or millennia of this existence, death in glorious battle might be the most merciful ending they can hope for. The weight of knowledge is its own burden. Ancient dreadnoughts often serve as repositories of chapter history, living connections to the past who can provide first-hand accounts of events that are otherwise preserved only in records and legends. This makes them valuable, but also creates psychological pressure. The pilot feels responsible for preserving and transmitting this knowledge, for ensuring that the lessons of the past are not forgotten. But memory degrades, details blur, and eventually the pilot must face the reality that they are failing in this duty, that the history they carry is being lost, despite their best efforts to maintain it. Some pilots report experiencing identity confusion, moments where they are not entirely sure who they are. Am I still brother captain whoever, or have I become something else entirely? Am I a person or a weapon? Am I alive, or am I already dead and simply not willing to admit it? These existential questions have no comfortable answers, and dwelling on them can lead to psychological paralysis. But ignoring them entirely requires a kind of deliberate self-delusion that has its own costs. The psychological burden of being a Dreadnought pilot is, in many ways, worse than the physical limitations. The body is gone, but perhaps that can be adapted to, accepted as a price of continued service. But the erosion of self, the slow transformation from person into thing, the awareness that you are losing your humanity by degrees and cannot prevent it no matter how hard you fight, this is a torment that few other beings in the galaxy must endure. It is a living death that denies the mercy of actual death while offering none of the benefits of actual life. And it goes on, awakening after awakening, century after century, until finally either madness or destruction brings the long nightmare to an end. Chaos. Corruption, the Hellbrute's torment. If the existence of a loyal Dreadnought pilot is torment, the existence of a Chaos Dreadnought, or Hellbrute as they are more commonly called, is absolute hell. Where the Imperium's Dreadnoughts at least maintain some pretense that internment is an honor, that service will eventually earn rest and reward, Chaos makes no such promises. To be sealed within a Hellbrute is punishment and torture wrapped in metal, a fate that even most Chaos Space Marines would rather avoid if given the choice. The awakening process for a Hellbrute is agony from the first moment. Where Loyalist Dreadnoughts typically have carefully calibrated systems designed to ease the pilot's consciousness back online gradually, the pseudo-parasitic sarcophagi of Hellbrutes have no such considerations. The technology is corrupted by warp energies, merged with demonic influences, twisted into forms that prioritize power over the pilot's well-being. When a Hellbrute awakens, it is not a gentle return to consciousness, but a violent shock, as systems surge to life with total disregard for the pilot's comfort or sanity. The pilot's flesh itself becomes corrupted. The warp energies that permeate the Hellbrute systems begin to transform the organic matter within the sarcophagus, merging it with the metal of the chassis in grotesque ways. Where a Loyalist pilot remains distinct from their mechanical shell, encased within it but separate, a Hellbrute pilot gradually fuses with the machine. Flesh grows into metal. Metal burrows into flesh. The boundary between organic and mechanical blurs and eventually disappears entirely. The machine becomes part of the pilot's body in a literal sense, and the pilot becomes part of the machine until neither can be distinguished from the other. This fusion is excruciating. The pilot experiences it as a constant sensation of their body being torn apart and reconstructed, bones breaking and reforming, nerves being flayed and rewoven. There is no anesthetic, no mercy, only endless pain that cannot be escaped because the source of the pain is the pilot's own existence. Some Chaos Space Marines volunteer for Hellbrute internment in moments of zealous devotion to their dark patrons, believing they will be granted power and immortality. They learn too late that the power comes at the price of unending torment, and the immortality is a curse rather than a blessing. The mental effects are equally horrific. The warp does not simply preserve consciousness as the Imperium's technology attempts to do. It corrupts consciousness, twisting thoughts and emotions, amplifying rage and hatred and despair while eroding any remaining traces of compassion or reason. The Hellbrute pilot's mind becomes a storm of violent impulses and traumatic memories. They relive their worst moments over and over, experience phantom pains from wounds long healed, feel emotions with intensity that would shatter a normal psyche. Many Hellbrute pilots go completely insane within their first few weeks of consciousness. they lose all coherent thought, becoming nothing more than engines of mindless destruction. These hellbrutes must be kept restrained when not in combat, chained down and their weapons removed, because they will attack anything in range, regardless of whether it is friend or foe. When the Chaos Warband needs them for battle, they are unchained and pointed toward the enemy, a barely controlled berserker that will tear through enemy lines with terrifying effectiveness before being restrained again, assuming they survive the battle. The pilots who maintain some degree of sanity find their existence even more torturous because they are aware of what they have become. They remember being Space Marines, proud warriors who fought for causes they believed in, even if those causes were the corrupt promises of the Chaos Gods. Now they are reduced to weapons that their former brothers fear and pity in equal measure. They are kept isolated when not needed, sealed away in darkness with only their own tortured thoughts for company. When they are awakened, it is not to seek their counsel or value their wisdom, but simply to use them as tools of destruction before discarding them again. The relationship between Hellbrute pilots and the rest of the Chaos Warband is fundamentally different from the relationship between Loyalist Dreadnoughts and their chapters. Where Loyalist pilots are revered as honored ancients, Hellbrute pilots are regarded as cursed things, necessary evils whose power is useful but whose existence is pitied or mocked. There is no respect, no honor, only utilitarian calculation about when the Hellbrute's destructive capacity is worth the risk and effort of deploying them. Some Chaos Lords use Hellbrute internment as punishment for warriors who have failed them or displeased them. It is considered one of the worst fates possible, worse even than death or banishment. The condemned warrior is sealed into the sarcophagus while still conscious, forced to endure the fusion process, fully aware of what is happening to them, knowing that this will be their existence for however long they survive. Their screams are considered entertaining by the more cruel Chaos Commanders, who might even delay completing the internment process to prolong the victim's suffering. For Wordbearers and similar chapters devoted to Chaos in its most religious forms, Hellbrute pilots might undergo additional tortures. Between battles, their sarcophagi are hung in chambers where demons circulate, attempting to possess or further corrupt them. The pilots are prevented from going fully insane by protective wards, ensuring they remain conscious enough to experience the demon's attentions. This creates a cycle where the pilot's sanity is deliberately maintained at just the level necessary for them to suffer, never allowed to escape into complete madness, but never granted the mercy of clarity either. The sensory experience of piloting a Hellbrute is reportedly far worse than that of a Loyalist Dreadnought. The corrupted Auspex systems do not simply show the tactical situation, they display it through a lens of warp-tainted perception where reality itself seems to writhe and shift. The pilot might see enemies as they truly are, or they might see demonic apparitions, or distorted nightmares drawn from their own fears and hates. Distinguishing between real threats and hallucinations becomes nearly impossible, adding another layer of psychological torment to an already unbearable existence. The weapon systems of a Hellbrute are often alive in a way that Loyalist Dreadnought weapons are not. Demon-possessed guns that hunger for kills, close combat weapons that drink blood and grant the pilot momentary relief from pain in exchange for feeding them. This creates a horrible dependency where the pilot becomes desperate for combat, not out of duty or even bloodlust, but simply because combat is the only time the weapons are satisfied, and the constant psychic pressure eases slightly. After the battle ends and the weapons are removed, the pressure returns worse than before, creating a cycle of addiction and withdrawal that further destabilizes the pilot's mental state. Some Hellbrutes develop capabilities that Loyalist Dreadnoughts lack, gifts from their dark patrons. They might manifest psychic powers without the training that would normally be required, destructive telekinesis or mind-rending attacks that add to their combat effectiveness. They might sprout additional limbs or weapons, their corrupted forms transcending the limitations of the original chassis design. But each of these gifts comes with its own torments. The psychic powers create feedback that feels like the pilot's brain is being cooked inside their skull. The additional limbs are sources of constant pain as flesh and metal grind against each other in configurations that should be anatomically impossible. The dreams, or whatever passes for dreams in the warp-touched consciousness of a Hellbrute pilot, are nightmares beyond description. Where loyalist pilots experience merciful oblivion during stasis, Hellbrute pilots are never truly unconscious. The warp does not permit it. They exist in a kind of semi-awareness, consciousness suspended but not absent, trapped in psychic spaces where demons play and torment for what might be moments or centuries. Linear time has no meaning in these spaces. A Hellbrute pilot might experience subjective millennia of torment between awakenings that in reality are separated by only months. Some Hellbrute pilots retain enough coherence to beg for death. They plead with their commanders to simply destroy them, to end their existence, rather than continuing to use them. Most such pleas are ignored. The pilot's suffering is irrelevant compared to their utility as a weapon. Some commanders actively enjoy the pilot's torment, seeing it as appropriate punishment, or simply finding amusement in the suffering of a being that was once a mighty warrior. Only if the Hellbrute becomes too unstable to use effectively, attacking allies as often as enemies, will it typically be destroyed. And even then, the destruction is framed as putting down a rabid animal, rather than granting mercy to a suffering brother. The knowledge that they will never escape, that this existence will continue until they are finally destroyed in battle or succumb completely to madness, weighs on those pilots who retain enough awareness to comprehend their situation. There is no hope of rest, no promise of eventual reward for faithful service. The Chaos Gods care nothing for their suffering, except insofar as that suffering can be weaponized or used to feed the dark powers. The Warband sees them as tools, and they themselves are trapped in shells that are slowly consuming their minds and souls, turning them into things that can no longer be called human or even truly alive. Yet in a grim irony, some Hellbrute pilots cling to their existence with desperate fervor. The alternative to this torment is not peaceful rest, but oblivion, or worse, having their souls claimed by the Chaos Gods they served in life. The Hellbrute's mechanical shell provides some protection against that fate, a barrier between the pilot's essence and the hungry entities of the warp. So they endure, not because they want to exist, but because they fear what non-existence might bring. It is survival driven entirely by terror, with no hope that circumstances will improve. Only the grim determination to continue for one more day, one more battle, one more awakening into a hell that never ends. Famous examples and their awakenings. The lore of Warhammer 40,000 is rich with accounts of specific dreadnoughts and their experiences. These individuals provide concrete examples of what awakening can mean, how different pilots cope with the burden of existence, and what becomes of consciousness over the centuries, or millennia, of this strange half-life between death and service. Bjorn the Fell-Handed stands as perhaps the most famous dreadnought in the entire Imperium. He is the oldest living space marine, having fought during the Great Crusade alongside his Primarch Leman Russ, and having survived the Horus heresy that nearly destroyed the Imperium. Bjorn has been interred in his dreadnought chassis for over 10,000 years. He remembers the Emperor not as a distant god figure, but as a person he served alongside. He knew the Primarchs as brothers and comrades, rather than as mythological heroes. His perspective spans the entire history of the modern Imperium. Yet Bjorn is awakened only rarely. The Space Wolves recognize that even his formidable mind cannot endure constant consciousness for such vast spans of time. He sleeps away the centuries, waking only when the chapter faces its gravest threats or when ceremonial occasions demand his presence. Every century, he is awakened to hold court at the Great Feast, where he recounts tales from his long saga to the assembled Space Wolves. These moments are sacred to the chapter, opportunities to hear first-hand accounts of the founding, of the Primarch's deeds, of battles that have passed into legend. When Bjorn awakens, those present report that there is always a moment of confusion, a brief period where he is not entirely sure when he is or what is happening. He might ask after brothers who have been dead for millennia, or refer to current situations using outdated terminology. But this disorientation fades quickly, his massive experience and iron will allowing him to orient himself and take stock of current circumstances with impressive speed. During these awakenings, Bjorn provides counsel that draws on 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom, offering perspectives that no other being in the Imperium can match. Yet even Bjorn admits that the loneliness cuts deep. In conversations with chapter leadership, he has spoken of the burden of being the last, the sole survivor of an age that is otherwise gone. Everyone he fought alongside in the Great Crusade is dead. The Imperium he helped build has transformed into something he barely recognizes. He exists as a living bridge to the past, but that bridge leads nowhere because the past is irrecoverable. His service continues because duty demands it. But there are hints in the few recorded conversations that even Bjorn's legendary resolve is not infinite. He endures because space wolves endure, but the weight of millennia is visible even in a being as mighty as he. Ancient Rylanor of the Emperor's Children presents a different but equally compelling example. Rylanor was interred in a Dreadnought during the Great Crusade, continuing to serve his legion with distinction. But when his brothers turned to chaos during the Horus Heresy, Rylanor refused to follow. He remained loyal to the Emperor, even as his entire legion fell into corruption and excess. After the heresy, he found himself isolated on a plague-ridden world, trapped and unable to escape, but unwilling to surrender to the chaos that had claimed his brothers. Rylanor remained awake for 1,000 years. Where most dreadnoughts must be placed in stasis to preserve their sanity, Rylanor endured a millennium of consciousness, alone on a dead world, with only his loyalty and his hatred for what his legion had become to sustain him. This is nearly unthinkable in terms of the psychological strain involved. A normal dreadnought pilot experiences time loss and disorientation from being awakened after decades or centuries of stasis. Rylanor experienced a continuous millennium, fully aware of every moment, watching the ruins around him decay further, knowing his former brothers had become monsters, unable to communicate with anyone or receive any respite from his solitude. When elements of the Emperor's Children finally returned to that world millennia later, Rylanor was still functional, still sane enough to execute a plan of vengeance against them. His loyalty had not wavered despite 1,000 years of isolation and the knowledge that he had been forgotten by the Imperium. He continued to serve. Rylanor's story demonstrates the upper limits of what a dreadnought pilot can endure, but it also shows the terrible cost. His final act was one of defiant sacrifice, choosing death in service of vengeance against the traitors his brothers had become. He had endured for millennia, not because existence brought him joy or even satisfaction, but because dying without striking back against corruption would have been a betrayal of everything he believed in. Ancient Tancred of the Black Templars represents another archetype, the warrior who has become more machine than man in thought as well as form. Tancred has served for centuries, and his personality has compressed down to its most essential military components. He speaks in terse battlefield assessments, thinks in terms of tactics and enemy force compositions, displays little of what might be recognized as emotion. Some might argue that Tancred has lost his humanity, that he is essentially a sophisticated weapons platform that happens to use a Space Marine brain as its operating system rather than a cogitator. But others would counter that Tancred has simply adapted to his existence by shedding everything non-essential. He has pared away sentiment and replaced it with purpose. He does not mourn fallen brothers, because mourning serves no tactical function. He does not dwell on his transformation, because dwelling on it would not change his circumstances. Tancred is an exemplar of a certain coping strategy. Accept what you have become, and be that thing as effectively as possible. There is a purity to this approach, a kind of Zen-like acceptance that might be healthier than the alternative of constantly fighting against an unchangeable reality. Davian Thule of the Blood Ravens presents a more troubled example. Thule was a captain who distinguished himself in multiple campaigns before suffering catastrophic injuries that necessitated his internment in a dreadnought. His awakening and subsequent service were marked by instability and difficulty adapting to his new existence. He struggled with the sensory changes, with the loss of his mortal form, with the weight of expectations placed upon him as an ancient. In battle, he was formidable, but outside of combat, he experienced significant psychological challenges that required careful management by the chapter's chaplains and apothecaries. Thule's story is important because it represents what happens when a relatively young space marine is interred before they have had centuries to develop the mental resilience that helps older warriors adapt. He was still forming his identity as a warrior when that identity was forcibly changed by his transformation into a dreadnought. The person he was becoming was never allowed to fully develop, replaced by something he did not choose and struggled to accept. His fate, after being deployed during a particularly catastrophic campaign, remains unknown, leaving his story as a cautionary tale about the costs of preservation at any price. The Space Wolf's Murderfang represents the darkest outcome, the pilot who has gone completely feral. Whatever space marine once occupied that chassis is gone, replaced by a consciousness that exists only to kill. Murderfang cannot distinguish between friend and foe when awakened. He attacks everything in range with mindless fury, driven by a rage that cannot be reasoned with or controlled. The Space Wolves deploy him only when they need pure destructive force and can ensure he is pointed at the enemy before being unleashed. After the battle, if he survives, he must be forcibly restrained and returned to stasis before he causes friendly casualties. Murderfang's existence raises profound questions. Is there still a person in there somewhere, buried beneath the rage and madness? Or has the original pilot been completely replaced by animal fury? If the former, is he aware of what he has become, trapped and screaming inside a mind that no longer follows his will? Or if the latter, at what point did the transition occur? When did the Space Marine cease to exist and the feral killing machine take his place? And most disturbingly, is this the eventual fate awaiting all Dreadnought pilots who exist long enough? The final degradation that comes after centuries of accumulated psychological trauma. For the Blood Angels and their successors, Death Company Dreadnoughts represent a unique tragedy. These pilots have succumbed to the Black Rage, their consciousness trapped in a permanent delusion where they believe they are sanguinious fighting at the siege of terror. Their awakening is not a return to present reality, but a plunge into the past, or rather into a psychic echo of the past that has been burned into their gene seed. They do not know their brothers or recognize their commanders. They cannot be reasoned with or directed in the traditional sense. They can only be pointed at enemies and unleashed, whereupon they fight with berserker fury until either the enemy is destroyed or they are. What do these pilots experience? Do they believe each awakening is the same moment, the same battle being fought over and over? Or do they experience some progression, some narrative continuity within their delusion? The Blood Angels do not speak extensively about this, treating their afflicted brothers with respect and sorrow, but not dwelling on the specifics of their torment. But the existence of Death Company Dreadnoughts suggests that there are fates even within the Dreadnought existence that are worse than the standard torment. That madness can take forms that transform the pilot into something that can no longer be considered a person at all. Ancient Helveticus of the Dark Angels carries secrets, as befits his chapter's character. The Dark Angels maintain secrets about their founding and the betrayal that split their legion during the heresy. Their dreadnoughts often serve as guardians of these secrets, warriors who can be trusted with knowledge too dangerous for younger brothers to know. When Helveticus awakens, he must not only reorient himself to current circumstances, but also assess what secrets can be shared with whom, what knowledge must remain buried, and how to guide the chapter without revealing the full extent of what he knows. This additional burden of secret keeping adds another layer of isolation. Helveticus cannot speak freely even with his brothers. Everything he says must be carefully weighed, every response calculated to protect the chapter's hidden shames. His awakening is thus not just a return to consciousness, but a return to vigilance, constant awareness that even among his brothers he must maintain deceptions and half-truths. The psychological strain of this, combined with the normal burdens of Dreadnought existence, creates a uniquely difficult existence even by the standards of ancient warriors. These examples collectively illustrate the range of what Dreadnought existence can entail. Some pilots like Bjorn maintain their core identity across millennia through force of will and chapter support. Others like Tancred adapt by transforming into something more machine than man, shedding humanity as unnecessary weight. Still others like Murderfang succumb entirely to madness and rage. And some like Rylanor endure beyond all reasonable limits through sheer, stubborn loyalty to principles they will not abandon regardless of cost. There is no single Dreadnought experience, but all variants share the common threads of sacrifice, isolation, and the slow erosion of everything that once made them recognizably human. The role they must play upon awakening, a Dreadnought pilot does not have the luxury of gradually reintegrating into chapter life. They are awakened for specific purposes, and those purposes are typically urgent. There is a crisis to address, a battle to fight, a situation that requires the particular capabilities or wisdom that only an ancient warrior can provide. The pilot must transition from the void of stasis to full combat readiness with minimal preparation time, and the expectations placed upon them are immense. The most common reason for awakening a Dreadnought is tactical necessity. The chapter faces an enemy or situation that requires heavy firepower and armored resilience. Dreadnoughts excel at breaking through fortified positions, destroying enemy vehicles and monsters, and holding critical objectives against overwhelming opposition. When one is awakened for battle, they are expected to immediately understand the tactical situation, identify threats and opportunities, and employ their weapon systems with devastating effectiveness. There is no time for confusion or disorientation. The fact that the pilot might have been asleep for a century is considered irrelevant. They are a weapon, and weapons must function when needed. Many pilots find this expectation both motivating and crushing. On one hand, knowing that you are needed, that your capabilities make a difference in the chapter's survival and success, provides purpose and meaning. You are not being preserved simply for preservation's sake, but because you have value, because your presence on the battlefield changes outcomes. This knowledge can help sustain a pilot through the hardships of existence, giving them something to focus on beyond their own suffering. But it also means that every awakening comes with the pressure of high expectations. You must perform flawlessly, despite having just emerged from stasis. You must overcome centuries of temporal displacement and sensory shock to immediately engage in complex, deadly combat. And if you fail, if your disorientation causes mistakes, or your degraded capabilities prove insufficient, you bear the responsibility for the consequences. Beyond their tactical role, many Dreadnoughts are valued as sources of wisdom and historical knowledge. They have fought in campaigns that are now legends, served under officers who are now honored dead, witnessed events that shape the chapter's character and traditions. When awakened, they might be consulted by chapter leadership before major decisions, asked to recount specific past events, or called upon to settle disputes about proper interpretation of tradition and doctrine. This places the pilot in the role of living historian and sage, expected to remember clearly and accurately events that might have occurred centuries or millennia ago. The burden of this expectation is significant. Memory degrades, especially after repeated cycles of stasis and awakening. The pilot might not remember events as clearly as their brothers expect or hope. They might confuse details from different battles or struggle to provide the specific information being sought. But admitting to memory failure feels like admitting that you are no longer capable of fulfilling your role, that the degradation has progressed to the point where your value is diminished. Many pilots will offer what they remember even when they are not confident in the accuracy, afraid that acknowledging uncertainty will lead to permanent retirement rather than temporary return to stasis. Some chapters formalize this advisory role by regularly awakening their ancients for council sessions. The chapter master and senior officers will gather to discuss strategic questions or doctrinal issues, and one or more dreadnoughts will be awakened to provide input based on their vast experience. These sessions can be valuable, offering perspectives that span centuries and preventing the repetition of past mistakes. But they also demonstrate the awkwardness of the dreadnought's position. They are part of the council yet separate from it, respected, but also regarded with a certain unease. Their advice is sought, but there is always a subtle question of how much weight to give counsel from beings who are not fully part of the present moment. For some pilots, particularly those who held senior ranks before their internment, there is an additional burden of seeing younger, less experienced Marines making decisions they believe are mistaken. A dreadnought, who once commanded companies, or even the entire chapter, must now watch as others hold those positions, sometimes executing strategies the ancient warrior believes are flawed. The pilot might offer advice, but ultimately, they are not in command. They must watch decisions unfold, knowing they would have chosen differently, bearing the knowledge that their experience is valued but not definitive. That time has moved on, and with it, the authority they once held. In battle, dreadnoughts often become focal points for their forces. Their imposing presence, formidable firepower, and historical significance make them natural rallying points. Space Marines who might waver in the face of overwhelming enemy forces find their resolve strengthened by fighting alongside an ancient warrior. The knowledge that this towering engine of destruction once walked among them as a brother, that it contains the spirit of a hero who refused to accept death as an excuse to stop serving, provides inspiration that can turn desperate situations into victories. But this means that the dreadnought pilot must maintain that inspirational presence even when they are struggling with confusion, pain, or doubt. They cannot show weakness because others are drawing strength from their example. The mechanical voice that emerges from the Vox speakers must speak with confidence and authority, regardless of what the pilot is actually feeling inside the sarcophagus. It is a performance, one that must be maintained throughout combat, and often in interactions before and after as well. The relationship between dreadnought pilots and the tech marines, who maintain their chassis, is particularly important. These tech marines are responsible for the dreadnought's mechanical functions, for conducting repairs and performing the rituals that keep ancient systems operational. They awaken the pilot and return them to stasis, manage life support systems, and monitor for signs of critical degradation. In many ways, the tech marines know the dreadnought more intimately than anyone else, understanding the subtle ways that systems interact and the specific quirks of each individual chassis. For the pilot, the tech marines are lifelines, the beings who can ease their suffering or prolong it, who can provide merciful maintenance or neglectful oversight. A good tech marine will minimize the pilot's discomfort, will explain what is happening during awakenings, will listen when the pilot reports problems with systems or sensors. A poor tech marine might treat the pilot as just another machine to be serviced according to rote procedures, showing no consideration for the consciousness trapped within. The quality of this relationship can significantly impact the pilot's experience of dreadnought existence. Some dreadnoughts form bonds with specific tech marines that become the closest things to friendships the pilot can have. The tech marine visits regularly, even when the dreadnought is not being awakened, performing maintenance while speaking to the sarcophagus, telling the sleeping pilot about chapter events and happenings. The pilot, upon awakening, might specifically request that particular tech marine's presence, finding comfort in the familiar voice and practiced touch. These relationships highlight the humanity that persists even in beings who have become more machine than man. the need for connection that cannot be entirely suppressed, no matter how much else is taken away. When the battle or crisis that prompted the awakening is resolved, the Dreadnought faces an experience that many describe as worse than awakening itself: the return to sleep. Systems begin shutting down in reverse sequence. Sensory input fades. Motor control is locked out, and the pilot's consciousness, knowing what is coming, must face the descent into that void once more, not knowing when or if they will wake again. For some, this is relief, a welcome respite from the burden of existence. For others, it is terror, the fear that this time they will not wake at all, or that the next awakening will be the one where their mind has degraded beyond recovery. The moments before final shutdown are often the most psychologically difficult. The pilot suspended between consciousness and oblivion, with time to dwell on all the losses, the isolation, the horror of what they have become. The return to sleep. The battle is over. The crisis has passed. The Dreadnought has fulfilled its function, has served the chapter as required, and now the time has come to return to the stasis vaults. For the pilot, this transition brings a complex mix of emotions that vary, depending on the individual's psychological state, the length of the awakening period, and their experiences during consciousness. The shutdown sequence is a gradual process, not dissimilar to the awakening but in reverse. First, weapon systems are locked out and made safe. The Dreadnought cannot accidentally discharge its armament during the shutdown process. Then motive systems are disabled, preventing movement but maintaining posture so the Dreadnought can be positioned properly for transport back to the stasis vault. External sensors begin filtering out and then eventually cutting off entirely as the pilot's need for environmental awareness diminishes. Internal systems monitoring starts taking over, focusing on the sarcophagus and life support rather than the battlefield. During these stages, many pilots experience a sense of profound vulnerability. Throughout the awakening period, despite all the psychological challenges, they at least possessed agency. They could perceive the world around them, could make decisions, could act upon their environment. Now that agency is being systematically removed. They are being rendered helpless, conscious, but unable to influence their circumstances, aware, but increasingly cut off from external reality. It is a kind of sensory deprivation that begins while full consciousness still remains, creating a claustrophobic panic in some pilots. Tech Marines monitor the shutdown process closely, watching for signs of distress or resistance. A pilot who fights against the shutdown, trying to maintain control of systems that are being taken offline, can cause damage to the neural interfaces or the sarcophagus itself. The Tech Marines will attempt to calm such pilots through Vox communication, reminding them that the process is necessary and will be completed regardless of resistance. That cooperation will make the transition easier. Most pilots understand this intellectually, but the primal panic of losing control can override rational thought. Some pilots use this final period of consciousness to make requests or offer final observations. They might ask the attending Tech Marine to perform specific maintenance during the stasis period, to check particular systems that felt wrong during the awakening, to ensure certain weapons are properly blessed before the next deployment. Others take the opportunity to pass messages to chapter leadership, observations about the battle just concluded, or concerns about situations they perceive developing. The Tech Marines listen and record these communications, though not all requests can or will be honored. Some are technologically impossible, others tactically irrelevant, and a few might reflect the pilot's degraded mental state rather than genuine operational concerns. For pilots who have maintained close relationships with specific individuals, these final moments might be used for farewells. A particularly honored Dreadnought might have chapter officers present during shutdown, and the pilot can exchange final words with them before consciousness fades. These conversations are often formal, constrained by the knowledge that this might be the last interaction for decades or centuries, that the individuals present might well be dead before the next awakening. There is no casual "see you next week" when your next meeting might be separated by 100 years and multiple generations. The actual moment of consciousness fading is described by pilots in various ways. Some report that it feels like falling, a vertiginous sensation of dropping through darkness with no bottom in sight. Others describe it as a gradual dimming, like lights being extinguished one by one until only darkness remains. Still others experience it as a kind of dissolution, the boundaries of self becoming indistinct and finally disappearing entirely as conscious thought ceases. There is generally no pain in the transition itself, though the psychological discomfort can be intense. What the pilots fear most is what comes after. Most report that stasis is supposed to be nothing, a complete absence of experience where time does not pass from the pilot's subjective perspective. You close your eyes and open them again, and between those moments, there is no between, only a discontinuity where centuries might have elapsed, but feel like no time at all. This is the theoretical ideal, the mercy that stasis is supposed to offer. But many pilots report that the reality is different. Some experience what they describe as darkness, not the absence of sensation, but an active presence of void, as if they are aware of being in that emptiness, even though there should be no awareness at all. Others report fragmentary sensations, disconnected images or sounds that might be memories surfacing and fading, or might be something else entirely. A few claim that they can sense time passing during stasis, not accurately enough to count days or years, but enough to know that they are not experiencing true unconsciousness, but rather some strange twilight state between awareness and oblivion. The nature of these experiences is debated. Are they genuine phenomena, or are they false memories constructed by the mind during the awakening process, the consciousness attempting to fill a gap it cannot truly remember? The neural activity of a space marine in stasis is minimal, but not absent. Life support systems must maintain basic biological functions, and this requires some degree of neural activity. Perhaps that minimal activity generates experiences that cannot quite be called dreams, but are also not complete unconsciousness. For some pilots, these phantom experiences during stasis are more disturbing than the waking existence. At least when conscious and piloting the Dreadnought, they know where and when they are, can interact with reality however limited that interaction might be. But the stasis void offers no reference points, no context, no way to distinguish between moments that last subjectively for seconds and those that stretch across subjective centuries. Some pilots report experiencing what feel like eternities of isolation in that darkness, trapped with only fragmentary thoughts and the awareness of their own consciousness, but nothing else. Others claim they are not alone in the darkness, that there are presences there, voices or entities that they cannot quite perceive clearly, but know are present. The chapter's librarians, when asked about such reports, typically offer explanations rooted in warp phenomena. The consciousness of a space marine, even one sealed in a stasis vault, exists partly in the materium and partly in the immaterium. It is possible that during the suspension of normal consciousness, the pilot's awareness drifts in the warp, experiencing echoes and impressions from that realm of chaos and unreality. This would explain the sense of presences, the distorted time perception, the fragmentary visions that have no clear connection to memory or current reality. But this explanation offers little comfort. If the stasis void is not empty, but rather opens onto the warp, then every period of sleep is not rest, but another form of torment. Not all pilots report these disturbing experiences. Some claim their stasis periods are exactly what they should be, nothing. They shut down and immediately awaken, with no subjective experience of the time between. These pilots consider themselves fortunate, though they also wonder if their lack of stasis experiences indicates something about their degrading consciousness. Are they simply forgetting the void experiences immediately upon awakening? Or are their minds so thoroughly adapted to the Dreadnought existence that even the distinction between consciousness and unconsciousness has become blurred. The chapters make efforts to minimize stasis duration when possible. Dreadnoughts who have been awakened are often kept conscious for at least the immediate debriefing and any necessary repairs before shutdown. This is partly practical, allowing the tech marines to work with the pilot's cooperation, but also partly merciful. The longer a pilot can delay return to stasis, the more they feel like participants in the chapter's ongoing story, rather than relics pulled out for specific occasions. But extended consciousness has its own costs. The neural strain accumulates. Systems begin degrading from continuous use, and the pilot's mind, subjected to the constant input and stress of maintaining the Dreadnought interface, starts showing signs of fatigue. Some pilots develop a complicated relationship with stasis. They dread the return to the void, but they also recognize that consciousness brings its own suffering. The isolation, the grief, the constant reminder of what they have lost and can never regain. These wear on the psyche. Stasis at least offers a respite from awareness, even if that respite is not as merciful as they might hope. These pilots approach shutdown with a kind of weary resignation, neither eagerly seeking it nor desperately resisting it, but simply accepting it as the inevitable conclusion of each awakening cycle. Others develop rituals or mental practices to help them through the transition. They might recite specific prayers or battle cant as consciousness fades, using the familiar words as anchors to maintain their sense of self as long as possible. They might deliberately focus on specific memories, attempting to burn them into whatever level of awareness persists during stasis, so they will not fade further before the next awakening. They might engage in mental calculations or tactical reviews, keeping their thoughts organized and structured until the very last moment before shutdown, believing that this discipline will help them maintain cognitive function across the long sleep. The moment of actual shutdown, when the last systems finally cease and consciousness ends, is one that no pilot can fully describe, because by definition, they are no longer conscious to experience it. But many report that the approach to that moment feels like standing at the edge of an abyss. You can see it coming, can feel the darkness rising to meet you, but cannot stop or avoid it. You can only fall forward into it and hope that when you wake, enough of you will remain to remember who you were and why you continue to serve. And then there is nothing, or there is void, or there is that strange twilight awareness that might be real, or might be the mind's attempt to process something it was never designed to experience. The Dreadnought stands silent in its stasis vault, mechanical systems maintaining minimal function, armored shell protecting the precious cargo within. Outside, the chapter continues its existence. Battles are fought, brothers die and are replaced. The galaxy turns through its endless cycles of war and death, and brief respites that are never quite peace. Inside the sarcophagus, the pilot either experiences nothing or experiences something that they will struggle to articulate when next awakened. Time passes, measured by the chapter in decades and centuries, unmeasured by the pilot for whom time has ceased to have meaning. And eventually, the cycle begins again. Alarms sound in the fortress monastery. Tech marines rush to the stasis vaults. Systems begin powering up. And consciousness, dragged back from whatever void it inhabited, begins the long, painful climb toward awareness once more. Conclusion. The awakening of a Dreadnought, after centuries of sleep, is not a triumphant return, but a kind of resurrection that might better be called a curse. These ancient warriors served the Imperium with a dedication that extends far beyond what could reasonably be demanded of any being, sacrificing not just their lives, but their very humanity in a slow erosion that spans centuries or millennia. They are honored, yes, but that honor is cold comfort when measured against the profound isolation, the temporal displacement, the gradual loss of self, and the knowledge that this existence will continue until destruction finally grants the rest that was denied when they were first interred. Each Dreadnought story is unique, shaped by their personality, their chapter's traditions, the specific pattern of chassis they inhabit, and the particular ways their consciousness adapts or fails to adapt to existence as a brain in a jar piloting a war machine. Some maintain their core identity across vast spans of time through force of will and institutional support. Others transform into something that can barely be called human, shedding emotion and personality to become pure tactical function. Still others succumb to madness, either the relatively merciful madness that brings unconsciousness, or the horrible madness that traps them in delusions and rage while their body continues to function as a weapon. For those of us who observe these warriors from outside, who see only the towering armored forms bristling with weapons, it is easy to forget that inside each shell is a person experiencing a form of existence that is fundamentally alien and profoundly lonely. The mechanical voice that speaks orders and wisdom is a person's voice, translated through systems that strip away nuance and emotion. The actions that seem so perfectly calculated and efficient are a person's choices, made despite confusion and pain and the weight of centuries pressing down on consciousness that was never meant to bear such loads. The lore of Dreadnoughts in Warhammer 40,000 captures something essential about the setting's character. In the grim darkness of the far future, even the highest honors are tinged with horror. Even the greatest heroes face fates that could reasonably be called curses. The Imperium demands absolute sacrifice from its servants, and nowhere is this more evident than in the existence of Dreadnoughts, warriors who literally cannot die because death would deprive the Imperium of valuable resources. Understanding what happens when a Dreadnought awakens after centuries of sleep requires grappling with questions about consciousness, identity, the nature of service and sacrifice, and the price of duty carried to its extreme logical conclusion. These warriors embody the Imperium's paradoxical mixture of reverence and ruthlessness, of honoring its heroes while simultaneously using them up in the endless grinding war that defines the setting. They are both inspiration and warning, demonstrating the heights of dedication while also showing the costs of existing in a civilization where your value as a weapon can override any consideration of your well-being as a person. The next time you see a Dreadnought on the tabletop, or read about one in the lore, remember that inside that armored shell is someone experiencing something we can barely imagine, awakening to find that everyone you knew is gone, that decades or centuries have passed while you experienced nothing,
that you must immediately function as a weapon despite the temporal displacement and sensory shock, and that when the battle ends, you will return to the void, not knowing when or if you will wake again. It is a sacrifice beyond death, service that extends past any reasonable limit, and a fate that encapsulates everything that makes Warhammer 40,000 such a uniquely dark and compelling setting. Thank you for joining me in exploring what happens when a Dreadnought wakes after centuries of sleep in Warhammer 40k. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the setting's most fascinating and tragic elements, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me continue creating detailed lore content about the grim darkness of the far future. Until next time, remember, even in death, some warriors are never truly allowed to rest.